She had 7 husbands, a collection of palaces, and a bottomless fortune. So how did Katherine Worthington end up alone and bankrupt? The answer begins with a photograph nobody wanted to keep. Before we dive into the story, what's the darkest case you've ever heard or experienced? Write it in the comments. Let's compare notes. Also, tell us where you're watching from today, and what time is it right now. We're building a community of truth seekers who aren't afraid of the dark. Now, let's continue with the story. A photograph discovered in the archives of the Chicago Historical Society shows a child's birthday party from 1918. 30 servants stand in formal rows behind tables laden with imported delicacies and crystallized sugar sculptures. A custom carousel shipped from Germany at enormous expense occupies the center of the manicured lawn, and in the middle of it all sits one small girl, her face turned slightly away from the camera, hands folded in her lap. She wears a dress that cost more than most families earned in a year. She is surrounded by everything money can purchase. She is completely alone. Katherine Worthington inherited the modern equivalent of $3 billion before her 10th birthday. The fortune came from 5 and dime stores that stretched across America. Humble shops selling thread and buttons and cheap household goods to working families. Her grandfather had built an empire from pennies and nickels, transforming small transactions into staggering wealth. By the time Katherine was born in 1912, the Worthington name meant more than money. It meant power, influence, and a kind of American royalty that no title could match. But the fortune came with a price that no accounting could measure. Katherine's mother, Margaret Worthington, was found in the bathroom of their Chicago mansion when Katherine was 4 years old. The official cause recorded in Cook County death certificates was accidental poisoning from sleeping medication. Her personal physician's private notes, discovered decades later, told a different story. Margaret had been deeply unhappy in her marriage to Edward Worthington, a charming but fundamentally hollow man who preferred European casinos to his wife and daughter. The notes described her growing depression, her isolation within the vast mansion, and her physician's increasing concern about her mental state. The word suicide never appeared in any official document, but the evidence preserved in private correspondence left little doubt. After Margaret's death, Edward Worthington effectively abandoned his daughter. Court documents reveal he departed from Monte Carlo 6 weeks after the funeral and returned to America only 3 times in the following decade. Always briefly, always when trustees required his signature on financial matters. Katherine was raised by a rotating staff of governesses and tutors, each hired by trustees who managed the fortune with careful precision, but showed no interest in the child's emotional well-being. The little girl in the photograph learned early that she lived in a golden cage. She had everything except what mattered most, and that birthday party in 1918, with its mechanical carousel and absent parents, was only the beginning of a life where genuine human connection would remain forever out of reach, no matter how much money she spent trying to buy it. By 1934, newspaper society pages across America called 17-year-old Katherine Worthington the richest girl in the world. Her coming-out party at the Plaza Hotel in New York cost more than most Americans would earn in their entire lifetimes. 1,200 guests, an orchestra flown in from Vienna, champagne that predated the French Revolution, photographers from every major publication crowded. The entrance, flashbulbs exploding as Katherine descended the marble staircase in a gown sewn with actual pearls. But private letters archived at the New York Public Library tell a different story than the glowing society columns. Katherine's correspondence with her former governess, Miss Adelaide Porter, reveals a young woman suffocating under attention that had nothing to do with who she actually was. In one letter dated March of that year, Katherine wrote, "Everyone knows my bank balance before they know my favorite color. They memorize my trust fund before they ask my opinions. I am not a person to them. I am an opportunity wearing an evening gown." The debutante season transformed Katherine into prey. Ambitious mothers engineered chance encounters with their sons at charity galas and museum openings. Aging European aristocrats, their titles legitimate but their coffers empty, arrived in New York with transparent intentions. Hollywood actors whose careers had begun to fade suddenly discovered a passion for the same charity causes Katherine supported. Every conversation carried an undercurrent of calculation. Every compliment felt rehearsed. Her trustees, concerned primarily with preserving and growing the fortune, hired private investigators to research anyone who showed interest in Katherine. Reports accumulated in filing cabinets at the Worthington estate offices. Background checks revealed gambling debts, failing businesses, expensive mistresses, and carefully hidden bankruptcies. One investigator's report from June 1934 documented a particularly brazen fortune hunter, a supposed Austrian count whose title was purchased from a theatrical costume company, and whose previous 3 wealthy wives had all divorced him under mysterious financial circumstances. Katherine read these reports late at night in her bedroom, learning that virtually everyone who pursued her as documented as some species of fraud or opportunist. But the investigations created a terrible paradox. How could she ever trust anyone when professional detectives found ulterior motives in every suitor? And yet, how could she not investigate when the evidence of predatory intention was so overwhelming? A diary entry from October of that year, preserved by Katherine's former lady's maid, who kept it for 5 decades before donating it to a historical archive, captures her desperation. The handwriting grows increasingly erratic across the page. I cannot tell who sees me and who sees the money. Perhaps there is no difference anymore. Perhaps I have become the fortune and nothing else remains. Mother understood this. Mother knew there was no escape. That final sentence reveals how deeply Margaret's suicide had marked her daughter. Katherine had begun to see her mother's death not as tragedy, but as prophecy, a glimpse of her own inevitable future. By the end of 1934, Katherine had received 47 marriage proposals. Her trustees had investigated all 47 men. Every single investigation revealed financial desperation, career failure, or documented histories of exploiting wealthy women. Not one suitor survived scrutiny as potentially genuine. On her 18th birthday, Katherine sat alone in her bedroom at the family's Fifth Avenue mansion, surrounded by gifts from people she barely knew. Jewelry from jewelers hoping for her future business, perfumes from parfumiers seeking her endorsement, books from authors wanting her patronage. Everything was transactional. Everything had a price calculated in her fortune. She had spent her entire conscious life learning that her wealth made authentic love impossible. Now she would spend the next 50 years proving that lesson correct over and over, at a cost that would eventually consume everything she had inherited. Marriage records from 1936. Katherine wed Danish Count Henrik Lundgren in a ceremony at St. Patrick's Cathedral that required 200 policemen to control the crowds. She was 20 years old. He was 38, devastatingly handsome, and spoke 5 languages with aristocratic precision. His family tree traced back to Danish royalty. His manners were impeccable. Her trustees' investigation had found nothing alarming in his background. Katherine later learned that the investigation had been deliberately incomplete. Lundgren had paid a former investigator from the Worthington firm $20,000 to omit certain details from the final report. The honeymoon lasted 6 weeks. The marriage lasted 18 months, and in that time, Henrik Lundgren executed one of the most methodical thefts of the era. Court testimonies from the divorce proceedings filed in New York Supreme Court in 1938 document the systematic transfer of assets. Within 3 months of the wedding, Lundgren had convinced Katherine to establish a joint account in Switzerland for their European expenses. She deposited $2 million. He began withdrawing it in increments small enough to avoid immediate notice. He purchased a chateau in the French countryside, placing the deeds solely in his name. When Katherine questioned this, he explained that French property law made it more advantageous for tax purposes. She trusted him. After all, he was her husband. He bought a shipping company in Copenhagen that existed only on paper, funneling Katherine's money through a maze of international transactions that her American accountants struggled to trace. He established trust funds for 3 supposed nephews who turned out to be the children of his actual mistress, a cabaret singer named Solange Merrier, who had been living in his Paris apartment throughout the entire marriage. Financial records show Katherine signed dozens of documents authorizing transfers, each presented to her elaborate explanations about currency exchanges, international investment opportunities, and estate planning. She signed because she desperately wanted to believe that this marriage was different, that Henrik loved her for something beyond her bank balance. The truth emerged in fragments. A hotel clerk in Zurich mentioned seeing the Count with a woman who was definitely not Katherine. A Paris jeweler sent a bill to the wrong address for an emerald bracelet Katherine had never received. A banker made an offhand comment about the other account during a routine meeting. Katherine hired private investigators who confirmed what she already knew but could not bear to admit. Henrik had never ended his relationship with Solange. He had maintained separate residences in 4 European cities. He had used Katherine's money to finance a lifestyle that included yachts, racing horses, and a gambling habit that cost thousands every week. The divorce proceedings were brutal. Henrik's attorneys argued that as her husband, he had legal rights to marital assets. They claimed the properties he had purchased were investments for their future. They suggested that Katherine's suspicions were products of paranoia and instability, hinting at her mother's suicide as evidence of hereditary mental illness. The settlement, finalized in August 1938, cost Katherine 6 million Lundgren, walked away with the chateau, the Swiss accounts, and various other assets he had acquired during their marriage. He showed no remorse during the final hearing. When asked by the judge if he had anything to say, he simply shrugged and replied in perfect English, "She could afford it." Katherine left the courthouse that day, understanding something fundamental about her future. Her wealth did not protect her, it marked her as a target, and no amount of investigation or caution could distinguish between men who were killed liars and men who might genuinely care. The only difference was how long it took for the truth to reveal itself and how much the revelation would cost. In 1942, Katherine married Preston Ashford, whose face had graced movie screens across America for nearly a decade. He had played heroes and romantic leads, his smile charming audiences from coast to coast. But by the time he met Katherine at a Hollywood charity event, younger actors were claiming the roles that once would have been his. Studio executives were returning his calls less frequently. His last 3 films had underperformed at the box office. Studio archives and private correspondence reveal how their relationship was orchestrated long before they actually met. Ashford's publicist, a calculating woman named Dorothy Crane, had identified Katherine as the perfect solution to her client's fading career. Memos from Crane to studio executives outlined the strategy with remarkable candor. Marry Ashford to the Worthington fortune. Generate massive publicity. Use the renewed attention to negotiate better contracts. Katherine's financial advisors saw opportunity from the opposite direction. Marriage to a beloved film star might rehabilitate her public image, still damaged from the scandalous Lundgren divorce. Newspaper columnists had begun calling her foolish and naive. Association with American royalty, Hollywood style, could transform the narrative. Neither Katherine nor Preston were told about these calculations. They were simply placed in each other's orbit repeatedly, until attraction seemed inevitable. The wedding generated more press coverage than any Hollywood event in years. 3,000 guests attended the reception at the Beverly Hills Hotel. Newsreel cameras captured every moment. For several months, Preston Ashford's career did indeed experience revival. He landed 2 major roles, negotiated a favorable studio contract, and saw his face return to magazine covers. But the marriage itself was a performance neither could sustain once the camera stopped rolling. Private letters between Preston and his brother reveal his true feelings. In one particularly cold passage dated March 1943, he wrote, "Katherine is pleasant enough, but I find myself exhausted by the pretense of affection. She wants a husband. I needed a financial arrangement. Neither of us got what we actually wanted. They maintained separate bedrooms in their bare mansion. Preston spent most evenings at studio parties or private clubs, occasionally bringing home gossip column mentions of mystery companions. Katherine busied herself with charity work and long trips to New York, often staying away for weeks. The arrangement might have continued indefinitely, both benefiting from the appearance of marriage, while living essentially separate lives. But Preston's gambling debts and expensive tastes began consuming money faster than even Katherine's fortune could comfortably sustain. Bills arrived for cars she had never seen, jewelry for women she had never met, losses at private poker games that approached hundreds of thousands. When she finally filed for divorce in 1945, Preston's attorneys demanded compensation for what they called his contribution to rehabilitating her public image and emotional well-being. The settlement included a Beverly Hills mansion worth $400,000, stock portfolios valued at nearly $2 million, and an arrangement labeled consultation fees that would pay Preston $5,000 monthly for the rest of his life. These payments continued until Ashford's death in 1968, long after his career had completely dissolved and he had remarried twice. Katherine wrote the checks faithfully every month, unable to stop herself from hoping that perhaps somewhere in the facade there had been a moment of genuine feel. But Preston's personal diary, sold at auction after his death, contained only one entry about Katherine. Written on their first anniversary, it read, "Remembered to send flowers today. Cost $200. She seemed pleased. This marriage has been the most profitable role of my career." Katherine's 1947 marriage to Prince Alex Volkansky promised everything the previous two had failed to deliver. Here was genuine European nobility, not a purchased title or Hollywood fabrication. The Volkansky family traced their lineage back 3 centuries to the court of Catherine the Great. Alex had grown up in a palace outside St. Petersburg, before revolution scattered his family across Europe. When they met at a diplomatic reception in London, he spoke passionately about art, literature, and philosophy. He quoted Russian poetry from memory. He seemed genuinely uninterested when conversation turned to business or money. For the first time since childhood, Katherine felt seen as something beyond her fortune. Embassy records and family archives reveal what Katherine could not see. The Volkansky family had lost everything in 1917, when the Bolsheviks seized their estates. Alex's mother and sisters lived in a cramped Paris apartment, surviving on money borrowed from distant relatives. His younger brother worked as a translator, barely making enough to eat. The family name still carried prestige in certain circles, but prestige could not pay debts or restore what revolution had destroyed. Alex saw Katherine as salvation, not just for himself, but for his entire bloodline. His courtship was carefully calculated to appeal to a woman desperate for authentic connection. He brought her books of poetry rather than jewelry. He spoke about preserving cultural heritage rather than acquiring new possessions. He introduced her to his family, and they welcomed her with warmth that felt genuine because, in its way, it was. They were not pretending to like her. They simply knew their survival depended on her fortune. The wedding took place at a cathedral in Rome with enough European nobility in attendance to make Katherine feel she had finally entered a world where her money was secondary to her identity as the Princess Volkansky. She had purchased not just a husband but an entire family, a heritage, a place in history. Then, months, Alex began the restoration project. First came the modest requests. Could Katherine help his mother secure better housing? The apartment in Paris was unhealthy, and his mother's fragile health required better conditions. Katherine purchased a villa outside Nice for $300,000. Then his younger brother needed capital to start a proper business, something worthy of the family name. Katherine established a trust fund of $500,000. His sister's husband had lost his position due to unfortunate political circumstances. Could Katherine help them acquire a small estate in Portugal where they might live with dignity? She could, and she did at a cost of $400,000. Alex himself identified properties across Europe that had once belonged to families like his, now available for purchase. Restoring them became his mission, and Katherine's money became the means. A chateau in the Loire Valley, an apartment building in Vienna, a villa on Lake Como. Each purchase was presented as cultural preservation, maintaining the heritage that revolution had tried to destroy. By 1951, when Katherine finally recognized the pattern, she had spent over $8 million on the Volkansky family and their various projects. The divorce settlement granted Alex ownership of most properties purchased during their marriage, valued at roughly $6 million. His attorneys argued successfully that these were gifts, not marital assets subject to division. Katherine attended the FINA divorce hearing alone. Across the courtroom, Alex sat surrounded by his mother, brother, and sister. The family, whose warmth had felt so genuine, now avoided her eyes. They had gotten what they needed. She had served her purpose. As she left the courthouse, Katherine understood with absolute clarity that her wealth made genuine love impossible. It did not matter how sincere someone seemed. Eventually, inevitably, the money became the relationship. Between 1952 and 1964, Katherine married 4 more times. Each wedding made headlines. Each divorce made her poorer, and each failure convinced her more deeply that she was fundamentally incapable of distinguishing love from calculation. The 4th husband was a polo player named Richard Kensington, whose athletic grace and easy charm masked debts to bookmakers across 3 countries. The marriage lasted 11 months. The settlement included 2 horses worth $60,000 and a ranch in Argentina that Katherine had purchased during their brief union. Richard sold both within a year. The 5th was a diplomat named Charles Fitzgerald, who convinced Katherine that his modest government salary proved he wanted nothing from her fortune. What he actually wanted was early retirement funded by her wealth. After 14 months of marriage, he walked away with investments worth nearly $3 million, claiming they were agreed-upon provisions for his post-diplomatic career. The 6th was Baron Ernst von Hoffmann, whose Austrian title was genuine, but whose castle had been sold to pay family debts decades earlier. He needed restoration money. Katherine provided it. 2 years later, the restored castle belonged entirely to him, and she was signing another divorce decree. The 7th and final husband was decorated war veteran James Morrison, who had saved lives during the Pacific Campaign and seemed to want nothing more than a quiet life. He lasted the almost 3 years before Katherine discovered he had been systematically transferring money to offshore accounts, building a nest egg that would eventually total nearly $4 million. Court records, financial documents, and testimony from her attorneys revealed the devastating pattern. Each man had identified her vulnerability and exploited it with precision. Each had studied the previous failures and adjusted his approach accordingly. The polo player offered athletic excitement. The diplomat promised intellectual partnership. The baron provided aristocratic legitimacy. The veteran appealed to her desire to help someone genuinely deserving. By the mid-1960s, journalists had nicknamed her the poor little rich girl, a phrase that appeared in over 400 newspaper articles. Columnists analyzed her marriages with cruel precision, speculating about her judgment, her desperation, her inability to learn from repeated mistakes. Some suggested she was addicted to marriage itself, unable to exist without a husband regardless of the cost. But private letters to her former governess, Miss Porter, tell a different story. Katherine understood exactly what was happening. She simply could not stop hoping that the next man might be different. In a letter dated December 1963, she wrote, "I know how this appears to the world. I know they think me foolish, but what they cannot don't understand is that living without hope is worse than living with repeated disappointment. If I accept that genuine affection is impossible, then Mother was right. And if Mother was right, then what purpose does any of this serve?" The 7 divorces had cost her approximately $30 million in direct settlements, not counting the properties, investments, and ongoing payments that continued long after the marriages ended. Her fortune, once unimaginably vast, had been reduced by nearly a third. But the financial damage was trivial compared to what the marriages had destroyed inside her. By 1965, Katherine Worthington no longer trusted her own judgment about anything. She could not determine whether a conversation was genuine or transactional. She could not tell if kindness was sincere or calculated. She could not distinguish between her own desires and what others had manipulated her into wanting. The wealth that should have given her freedom had imprisoned her in a fortress of suspicion where every human interaction was potentially another transaction she could not afford. By 1968, Katherine owned properties on 3 continents, but lived in none of them for more than a few months. Travel logs preserved by former staff members show constant movement: Paris in January, London in March, New York in May, Los Angeles in July and August, back to Paris by October. She was always surrounded by employees, drivers, secretaries, housekeepers, yet fundamentally alone in ways that money only intensified. The properties themselves became monuments to her isolation. The Park Avenue apartment remained fully staffed year-round despite Katherine spending perhaps 6 weeks there annually. Fresh flowers were delivered daily to empty rooms. Meals were prepared for no one. A skeleton crew maintained her London townhouse in perpetual readiness for visits that grew increasingly rare. The villa outside Nice, purchased for Alex's mother decades earlier and later reclaimed in legal proceedings, stood empty except for caretakers who dusted furniture no one would ever sit in again. Medical records from this period reveal increasing dependency on prescription medications. Her physicians in 3 different countries prescribed pills for anxiety, insomnia, and what they euphemistically termed nervous exhaustion. She took sedatives to sleep and stimulants to function during the day. The combination left her in a fog where days blurred together into undifferentiated weeks of airports, hotel suites, and identical conversations with staff who were paid to care about her well-being. Financial statements from 1968 show her wealth beginning to seriously diminish for the first time. The ongoing divorce settlements were one factor, but equally damaging were the poor investments her advisors recommended. She lost $2 million in a South American mining venture that existed mostly on fraudulent documents. Another $1 million disappeared into a shipping company that declared bankruptcy within 18 months. Her advisors were competent enough, but they were managing someone who no longer cared about returns or risk assessment, someone who signed documents without reading them because reading required energy she no longer possessed. The overhead of maintaining multiple estates ate through money at an alarming rate. Property taxes, staff salaries, maintenance, utilities and insurance for homes she rarely visited cost over $500,000 annually. Her accountant suggested selling properties, consolidating, reducing expenses. Katherine refused. The estates were proof she existed, that her life had substance beyond the succession of failed marriages and newspaper ridicule. Friends from this period, interviewed decades later by researchers, described a woman who could no longer trust her own judgment about anything. One former companion recalled Katherine spending an entire afternoon trying to decide whether to order chicken or fish for dinner, paralyzed by the fear that either choice would reveal some fundamental flaw in her character. Another remembered Katherine asking repeatedly whether their friendship was genuine, requiring constant reassurance that felt increasingly desperate and impossible to provide convincingly. The isolation was not just emotional, but practical. Katherine had alienated most people who had genuinely tried to know her by questioning their motives so relentlessly that friendship became exhausting. Those who remained were primarily paid employees who could not leave without losing their positions. She existed in a world where every relationship was fundamentally transactional, because she had made it impossible for anything else to survive. In 1970, Katherine's father Edward died in Monte Carlo, where he had spent most of the previous 40 years. She learned about his death from a telegram sent by the casino manager. Edward had not spoken to his daughter in over a decade. His will left her nothing because, as the attorney explained, he assumed she had more than enough already. Katherine did not attend the funeral. She spent that week alone in her Paris apartment, surrounded by staff who knew better than to disturb. grieving not for the father she had lost, but for the father she had never actually had. In 1975, Katherine withdrew almost entirely from public life, taking up residence in a suite at the Chateau Marmont in Los Angeles. She chose Los Angeles specifically because it was the one city where she had no meaningful history, no properties filled with memories, no ghosts waiting in familiar rooms. The hotel suite became her final fortress, a space small enough to control yet expensive enough to maintain the illusion that Cheadle commanded resources beyond ordinary comprehension. Staff records and delivery logs from the hotel show she rarely left her rooms. Meals arrived 3 times daily, often returned barely touched. Newspapers were delivered each morning and found folded unread by evening. Her only regular visitor was her attorney, a patient man named Gordon Sheffield, who had managed her legal affairs for nearly 2 decades and had watched her fortune systematically dismantled by men who saw her as opportunity rather than person. The suite itself became a museum of her 7 marriages. Jewelry from princes sat in velvet boxes on the dresser. Paintings acquired during her time with the diplomat hung on walls the hotel allowed her to modify. Photographs from various weddings covered nearly every surface. She surrounded herself with artifacts from a life that had promised everything and delivered only elaborate mechanisms of exploitation. Financial advisors' correspondence from this period reveals growing alarm. Katherine's fortune, once measured in billions, had diminished to tens of millions. The number sounds substantial until accounting for the ongoing costs of her life. The hotel suite alone cost $15,000 monthly. Medical expenses for her various physicians and prescriptions ran another $8,000. Legal fees for managing her remaining properties and handling disputes with ex-husbands continued to drain resources. Insurance, taxes, and the minimal staff she still employed consumed more. But the truly devastating costs were the ongoing payments to former husbands. Preston Ashford still received his $5,000 monthly even though he was now 71 and had not worked in years. Charles Fitzgerald's consultation fees had been renegotiated upward to $7,000 monthly after he threatened legal action. Richard Kensington had won a judgment requiring Katherine to maintain life insurance policies naming him as beneficiary. The legal and financial entanglements from 7 marriages created a web of obligations that would persist until death released her. New legal disputes emerged constantly. Ernst von Hoffmann sued, claiming she had promised him additional properties in verbal agreements the court could not verify but could not definitively disprove. The resulting settlement cost another $400,000. James Morrison's attorneys argued that his offshore accounts were actually joint marital assets she had helped establish, DEMA. She honored commitments she could not remember making. That dispute dragged through courts for 3 years, consuming money and legal fees that eventually exceeded the disputed amount. Her remaining properties were quietly sold. The Park Avenue apartment went first, purchased by an oil executive for $3 million. The London townhouse followed, then the villa in Nice. Each sale felt like amputation, removing pieces of a life that had already become unrecognizable. The money from sales immediately flowed into legal settlements, medical bills, and the daily expenses of maintaining even a reduced version of her existence. By 1980, Katherine rarely spoke except to order meals or request prescription refills. Hotel staff described a woman who seemed to exist in a permanent state of sedation, moving slowly through rooms filled with relics from marriages that had cost her everything. She was 63 years old, looked 80, and possessed a fortune that accountants estimated would last perhaps another 5 years if she dramatically reduced her expenses. She did not reduce them. Some part of her understood that maintaining appearances was the only thing standing between her current life and complete dissolution. By 1982, accountants' reports documented the impossible. Katherine Worthington, who had inherited the equivalent of $3 billion, faced genuine financial crisis. The math was straightforward and merciless. Decades of divorce settlements had consumed approximately $30 million. Poor investments in failed business ventures had eliminated another $20 million. The overhead of maintaining multiple properties for years had cost roughly $15 million. Legal disputes, ongoing payments to ex-husbands, and the accumulated expenses of her isolated lifestyle had devoured the rest at a rate that compounded annually. Her attorney, Gordon Sheffield, presented the numbers during a meeting in her hotel suite. In March of that year, she had less than $2 million remaining in liquid assets. The ongoing monthly expenses exceeded $40,000. At this rate, she would be completely bankrupt within 4 years. Sheffield's memo from that meeting, preserved in his firm's archives, noted that Katherine showed no reaction to the news. She simply asked if he could arrange for her prescription refills to be delivered more promptly. Properties that had not already been sold were now liquidated in increasingly desperate circumstances. The chateau in France, purchased during her marriage to Alex, and later reclaimed through complex legal proceedings, sold for far below its actual value because Katherine needed immediate cash. Jewelry accumulated over decades went to auction houses. A diamond necklace given by Henrik Lundgren, once valued at $400,000, sold for $180,000 to a collector who understood the seller's desperation. Her remaining staff were dismissed. The personal secretary who had managed her correspondence for 15 years received 2-month severance and a brief letter of recommendation. The driver who had worked for her since 1973 was let go with 1 month's pay. The housekeeper who maintained her hotel suite found new employment with another wealthy resident. Katherine was left with only hotel services and the increasingly rare visits from her attorney. Medical bills mounted as her health deteriorated. Decades of prescription medication dependency had damaged her liver and kidneys. Her physicians recommended hospitalization for proper treatment. She refused, knowing that hospital stays would accelerate her financial collapse. Instead, she continued taking medications that were actively harming her while seeing doctors who charged premium rates for house calls to the hotel. Legal disputes with ex-husbands continued, even as her resources evaporated. James Morrison filed another lawsuit, Cly. Ming, she owed him additional compensation based on properties sold during their marriage. The case had no merit, but defending it cost $30,000 in legal fees. Preston Ashford's estate executives, after his death in 1981, claimed Katherine owed back payments, another $20,000 in legal costs to resolve. Sheffield urged her to declare bankruptcy, which would at least provide legal protection from continued claims. Katherine refused. The Worthington name had meant something once. Bankruptcy would be final admission that everything her grandfather had built, everything she had inherited, had been completely squandered. Pride was the last thing she possessed, and she would not surrender it while she still had money, enough to maintain the fiction of solvency. By December 1982, she had begun selling personal effects to cover daily expenses. Books that had traveled with her for decades went to used bookstores for $20 or $30. Clothing she had worn to diplomatic receptions and royal weddings was sold to vintage shops. A painting she had bought with a diplomat during their brief marriage, something she had genuinely loved, was sold to a private collector for $8,000. She needed the money for hotel fees. The woman who had once owned palaces now calculated whether she could afford room service or should order something cheaper from a nearby restaurant. The mathematics of poverty were replacing the mathematics of wealth, and Katherine understood with absolute clarity that she had perhaps 2 years remaining before complete financial collapse. On May 11, 1988, hotel staff found Katherine Worthington deceased in her Los Angeles residence. She was 75 years old. The chambermaid who discovered her body that morning had knocked repeatedly before using her master key. Concerned because Katherine had not answered the door for her breakfast delivery, she found Katherine in bed, surrounded by photographs from her 7 weddings, as if she had spent her final hours trying to understand where everything had gone wrong. The coroner's report listed heart failure as the primary cause of death, but mentioned decades of prescription medication use and profound social isolation as contributing factors. Her physician's records showed a woman whose body had been systematically damaged by barbiturates, sedatives, and tranquilizers consumed in quantities that had steadily increased since the 1960s. Her liver function had been severely compromised. Her kidneys were failing. She had refused recommended treatments because she could no longer afford them. Her estate inventory filed in Los Angeles County Probate Court 6 weeks after her death documented the final accounting. Katherine Worthington had $3,500 in her bank account. A few items of jewelry remained, mostly pieces with sentimental rather than significant monetary value. Her hotel suite contained furniture that belonged to the establishment, clothing that was decades out of fashion, and books that were worth perhaps a few hundred total. But the debts exceeded everything. Outstanding hotel fees totaled nearly $40,000. Medical bills from various physicians approached $70,000. Legal fees for disputes, still unresolved, amounted to another $35,000. The estate was insolvent. Creditors would receive nothing. The woman who had inherited the equivalent of $3 billion died owing more than she possessed. Her funeral was arranged by Gordon Sheffield, who paid for it personally because the estate could not. It took place at a modest chapel in Los Angeles on a Tuesday afternoon. 17 people attended. Most were attorneys, estate administrators, and a few former staff members who had maintained some connection to Katherine over the years. None of her 7 ex-husbands came. Henrik Lundgren had died in Monaco in 1979. Preston Ashford had passed in 1981. Charles Fitzgerald was still alive but did not respond to notification of the funeral. Richard Kensington, Ernst von Hoffmann, James Morrison, and Alexa Volkansky were all living, but chose not to attend the burial of the woman whose fortune had funded their lives. The service lasted 20 minutes. Sheffield read a brief eulogy that focused on Katherine's charitable work in her younger years before the marriages, and the isolation consumed everything. He did not mention the fortune or the 7 husbands, or the spectacular financial collapse. He simply said she had been deeply lonely and deserved better than what life had given her. Katherine was buried in a cemetery outside Los Angeles, in a plot Sheffield had purchased, because she had made no arrangements for herself. The headstone was simple granite with her name, birth year, and death year. Nothing about the Worthington fortune or her position as once the richest girl in America. Just a name and dates that bracketed a life spent learning that unlimited money could purchase everything except the one thing she had desperately needed. Her story became a case study in wealth management courses and psychology journals. How had someone with billions ended with thousands? The answer was simpler than analysts wanted to admit. She had spent her entire life trying to buy love from people who only wanted her money, and by the time she understood this was impossible, she had already paid for the lesson with everything she had. If this story haunts you the way it should, hit that like button and subscribe, because the darkest chapters of history are the ones we need to remember most. These stories matter. Make sure you're here for the next one.